The New Adventures of Superman debuted on CBS on September 10th, 1966 at the 11 o'clock slot, and it was a huge success right off the bat.
So the influence of the show was that 50s type of era, like the George Reeves shows was from the 50s, had that kind of feel to the show, that mom, pop, good, wholesome American type of feeling.
When you get to the moments when the New Adventures of Superman is born, you're really at the first time that the networks are looking at Saturday morning as a programming opportunity and saying, let's do a slate of new stuff. What can we do? Where can we reach to?
Well, what was riding on the success of Superman, I didn't really know at the time, but it was all of Saturday morning.
Superman, rocketed to Earth as an infant when the distant planet Krypton exploded. And who, disguised as Clark Kent, mild mannered reporter for the Daily Planet, fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and freedom with superpowers.
Filmation was started by Lou Scheimer, Norm Prescott, and Hal Sutherland. Lou was an animator for the Bozo series for Larry Harmon, and Norman Prescott was a radio DJ, and they were friends with Hal, and that's how they got together and started Filmation as a commercial house.
We had 24 empty desks, a lot of people we owed money to, and it was Hal's week to answer the phone.
In 1965, the Filmation folks had gone to DC Comics looking for the license of Superman.
And Norm says, well, we got to prove to these guys that we can do this show. They want to give us all this money to produce this whole series.
He said, I think they want us to do it. He said, they want to see the studio. I said, what studio? I said, there's me, there's Hal, there's an empty desk, there are 14 other empty desks, and there's a mannequin out front. So, of course, Lou came up with a great idea, which is in history now, that he brought in family, friends, neighbors, co-workers from other studios to come in and fill the studio up with artists. So I called everybody I knew. I had an accountant. Thank God it didn't show up because he knew the guy. I called a bunch of animators. I hired a bunch of guys, or I got a bunch of guys from Hanna-Barbera to show up. And we filled the place up with people doing fake drawings. And Ted Knight, he was a buddy of mine. Ted Knight, I said, Ted, you're going to pretend that you're an editor, and we're going to borrow a moviola, and he doesn't know anything about a moviola. So if he comes in and I show him that you're working on a moviola, you say, I'm busy, there's trouble at the lab, I can't talk to you now. And we had the place all filled up.
And when the executives came from DC Comics, they walked around and saw all these hard-working guys doing all these drawings, and okay, well, pretty good. They've got a great bunch of guys here, and they're all working. They seem to know what they're doing. And one of the guys told Lou, listen, I've got to get back to the other studio.
And he shuts the door, and I said to Hal, dock that son of a gun. Then all of a sudden, he's ready to leave, and I hear Ted go, there's trouble at the lab. There's trouble at the lab. I was like, oh, Ted wants to give his line. No, God.
And the executives looked at each other and said, you know, he runs a really tight ship here. You know, this is really good. Let's give it to him. So that's how they got the contract to do Superman for CBS.
And they didn't know, those poor guys. Well, later on, I told the guy who we had bluffed. He didn't like it.
Wow, some fireworks.
Lou Scheimer and Norm Prescott were able to initiate their business, to start their business on the back of Superman, bringing the right character in at the right time and making a tremendous success out of it at its time.
Superman! Mercy, please!
I'm not going to hurt you, Professor. Just see that you're put in a safe place where you belong. Perhaps in a cage with the other monster.
The New Adventures of Superman was probably the most faithful adaptation thus far of any of the DC Comics work. I mean, the stories, while not taken directly out of the comics, the characters were on-modeled directly from they looked exactly like they did in the comics. And the feel of the stories was very much the same, even though the specifics weren't.
I mean, talk about wish fulfillment, the Signal Watch, that's in the cartoons.
Some of the villains were very faithful. Lex Luthor was very faithful, as done in the cartoon show. Brainiac, not so much. Brainiac in the comics was not as robotic. As a matter of fact, Superman didn't realize he was a robot android for a long time until it was revealed.
He's a computer, eh? So he's made of wires and transistors. I know how to stop him.
Parasite is a villain who was in the comics created for the 1960s, but was in the comics, very purpley, sort of disfigured and almost grotesque, whereas in the cartoon show, that really doesn't play for kids, so he's just a guy in a suit.
Not so fast. Astonished, Clark senses that somehow this strange man is draining him of his fabulous super strength. And Icy suddenly realizes he has hit the jackpot.
To a large extent, and it's funny, again, it's still an outgrowth of radio. I mean, not only just the cast and the narration, which was often telling you exactly what you were seeing on screen. Meanwhile, on Mountain Metropolis, and we're seeing a Mountain Metropolis, we know where we are. There was, I really think, and this is meant, I mean, no disrespect to the animators, but I honestly think you can watch this stuff with the TV turned off and just the sound on, and you still get the whole story. Because the villains are constantly telling you what they're doing, the heroes are constantly telling you what they're up against. Jimmy's constantly screeching about, oh gosh, Miss Lane, look, it's a giant dinosaur erupting from the sea.
Now, it uncorks a sealed cave, and a giant alligator climbs out and heads for the sea.
One of the things I find interesting about The New Adventures of Superman is using Bud Collyer and Joan Alexander as the voices of Clark Kent, Superman, and Lois Lane.
Same with Jackson Beck, who was a narrator of the radio show, came on to do the narration of the Superman series.
It's an interesting choice because the radio show by that time had been off the air for like 15 years, so it's not as if there was any sort of nostalgia factor attached to it. Their target audience of 8-year-olds is not going to remember anything about this. But conversely, they knew the characters. They knew that they didn't have to be trained.
So there was sort of continuity there, which is amazing that they would do that. And they didn't know whether or not they were going to hire 2 different actors, one to play Clark and one to play Superman. And Bud Collyer solves the problem by doing Clark in sort of his high tenor, gosh, Lois, I don't know why Jimmy would act this way, and then shifting down to his baritone for this looks like a job for Superman.
I've got a hunch this is a job for Superman.
When you talk about Superman's recognition value, popularity, presence as an icon, one of my favorite statistics is one from a market research study we did a few years ago, that something like 94% of people in Thailand who had access to a TV set knew who Superman was.
I guess it's the idea that you could fly. It's so wrought with the idea of freedom, just to fly out your window, away from your family and your troubles in school.
That great invincibility that we all aspire to and they all wish that we had.
I mean, I really hope that it's fun for people, but I hope people don't lose sight of what it was that drew them to these things in the first place.
I think New Adventures of Superman is going to be remembered fairly fondly because, first off, it was Filmation's first big show, and beyond that, it was also the first superhero cartoon on television.
As minimalist as these cartoons are, and the fact that I think that the appeal is mostly nostalgia, it's the gateway show that will allow them to come into the world of comic books and see what they're missing.
It was also the thing that put Filmation Studios on the map, and equally as important, it was at a time when Superman comic books were selling reasonably well, but they were in a bit of decline, so it certainly helped keep Superman in the public consciousness all throughout the 1960s.